Something extraordinary is unfolding in Washington right now, and if you think this is just another political disagreement or a routine trade negotiation, you are missing the real story. What is happening behind the scenes doesn't look like diplomacy. It doesn't even resemble traditional trade policy. It looks more like demolition. The structure that has held North American commerce together for decades is suddenly under pressure like never before, and the shockwaves are already spreading through financial markets, supply chains, and the everyday prices people pay at stores. For 30 years, the trade framework connecting the United States, Canada, and Mexico functioned as the backbone of one of the most powerful economic systems on Earth. Before it was modernized as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, it operated under the North American Free Trade Agreement, better known as NAFTA. The arrangement was never perfect. It sparked arguments, political fights, and constant renegotiations. But despite all that, it worked. Goods flowed across borders constantly. Businesses built supply chains that stretched across the entire continent. And every year, roughly $1.6 trillion in trade moved between the three countries like blood, circulating through a single economic body. Factories in the American Midwest relied on parts from Mexico. Canadian energy-powered American industries. Mexican manufacturers built products designed for North American markets. Every day, trucks rolled across borders carrying everything from car engines to fresh produce. It became so integrated that most people stopped thinking about it at all. The system simply functioned. But as of this morning, that sense of stability has been shaken. The reason is simple, and it centers on one decision. Former President Donald Trump didn't just hint at renegotiating the USMCA. He issued a set of demands so sweeping that if they were implemented, the entire agreement would be transformed into something Canada and Mexico might not even recognize anymore. The expectation in Washington seemed clear. The assumption was that America's two neighbors would reluctantly come to the table, negotiate quietly behind closed doors, and ultimately accept the changes. That's how these situations have often played out in the past. Economic pressure would be applied. Political rhetoric would escalate for a few days, and then the partners would compromise. But this time, the script changed completely. Instead of reacting separately, something unusual happened. Leaders in Ottawa and Mexico City did something Washington apparently did not expect. Before responding publicly, they spoke with each other. Prime Minister Mark Carney in Canada and President Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico coordinated their response. They didn't rush to appease Washington. They didn't issue cautious diplomatic statements designed to calm tensions. Instead, they stood together and sent a message that instantly changed the dynamic of the entire situation. The message was simple. North America's economic rules cannot be rewritten by one country alone. That moment may end up being remembered as the turning point because the consequences started appearing almost immediately. Currency markets reacted. Investors began calculating new risks. Supply chains that stretch across three countries suddenly faced uncertainty. And if this confrontation continues to escalate, it could affect something far more personal for millions of people, the prices they pay for cars, groceries, fuel, and everyday goods. Right now, the situation is tense. Inside Washington, trade officials are scrambling. Economic advisors are debating possible outcomes. Political commentators are arguing over details. But many analysts believe the real story is being missed. The real story is not just about a disagreement between governments. It's about whether the economic system that ties North America together is entering its most serious crisis since it was first built. Over the next few minutes, we're going to break down exactly what happened step by step. What were the demands coming out of Washington? Why did both Canada and Mexico reject them at the same time? And why are economists warning that the $1.6 trillion trade engine that powers the continent could now be closer to disruption than at any moment in its history? To understand how things escalated so quickly, you have to start with the moment it all began. Like many modern political confrontations, it started with a message posted early in the morning. Frustrated by what he described as unfair advantages built into the current trade system, Donald Trump argued that the scheduled 2026 review of the USMCA agreement was too far away. Instead of waiting for the planned renegotiation window, he announced a series of immediate demands, and they were dramatic. The first demand targeted Canada's agricultural supply management system. For decades, Canada has protected certain agricultural sectors like dairy and poultry through strict production quotas and import limits. Trump demanded that those protections be eliminated entirely. The second demand focused on Mexico's manufacturing sector. Trump called for Mexico to raise its minimum manufacturing wages dramatically, bringing them closer to American levels within just 12 months. Then came the third demand, which directly struck at the heart of the North American auto industry. Trump proposed new rules requiring that 90% of vehicle components be sourced from the United States. And finally, there was a sweeping digital trade proposal that would grant American technology companies unrestricted access to Canadian and Mexican markets without requiring the same level of access in return. But the most controversial part of the announcement wasn't the demands themselves, it was the timeline. Both countries were given just 48 hours to agree. If they refused, the United States would impose sweeping tariffs of 25% across multiple sectors. In previous years, a move like this would almost certainly have triggered quiet diplomatic negotiations. Government officials would board planes to Washington, meetings would be held behind closed doors, the public statements would remain polite and cautious. But this time, events unfolded very differently. Within 6 hours of the announcement, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to a podium in Ottawa. Standing beside him were the premiers of Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec, provinces that represent enormous portions of Canada's industrial and energy economy. Carney didn't appear nervous. He didn't appear uncertain. In fact, observers noted that he looked unusually prepared, as if his government had already considered the possibility that something like this might happen. When he began speaking, his tone was calm but firm. He said the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement was designed as a partnership, not a protection system designed to benefit only one country. And then he rejected the demands, not some of them, all of them. 2 hours later in Mexico City, President Claudia Sheinbaum held her own press conference. Her message mirrored Carney's almost exactly. She said Mexico would not accept conditions that treated a sovereign nation like a subordinate branch of another economy. She also announced that Mexico was prepared to expand trade relationships with other partners around the world if necessary. The coordination between the two countries was unmistakable. For the first time in the history of the USMCA, Canada and Mexico had responded to American pressure, not individually, but together. And that moment changed everything. The reaction from Washington came quickly. Donald Trump responded with a series of sharp statements, criticizing both leaders and accusing them of taking advantage of the United States for years. His language was blunt and confrontational, portraying the situation as proof that America had been treated unfairly by its trading partners. But while political rhetoric escalated online, the financial world was delivering its own verdict. Currency traders began reacting almost immediately. The Mexican peso wobbled briefly, but stabilized faster than many analysts expected. The Canadian dollar actually strengthened slightly against the US dollar, signaling that investors were not panicking about Canada's position. Meanwhile, in American markets, something more worrying began to happen. Manufacturing-related stocks started to drop. Investors understood something that political debates often overlook. The North American economy is deeply interconnected. Many industries don't exist within the borders of just one country anymore. They operate across all three. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the automotive sector. Modern cars are not built in a single factory using parts made in one nation. They are assembled through a complex network of suppliers that stretches across the entire continent. An engine might be manufactured in Mexico. Electronic systems could come from Ontario. Wiring harnesses might be produced in a factory in northern Mexico. Final assembly might take place in Michigan, Tennessee, or Texas. By the time a car reaches a dealership, its components may have crossed international borders 8 different times. That level of integration makes the system efficient and cost-effective, but it also makes it incredibly sensitive to disruptions. If tariffs are suddenly placed on goods every time they cross a border, the costs multiply rapidly. A 25% tariff doesn't just apply once, it can apply multiple times during the production process. That reality explains why shares of major automakers reacted so quickly after the announcement. Executives inside companies like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis reportedly began emergency meetings almost immediately. Procurement teams were instructed to examine alternative suppliers outside North America, not because they want to abandon the region, but because they have to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The logic is straightforward. If cross-border trade becomes too expensive or unpredictable, companies will be forced to redesign their supply chains entirely, and redesigning supply chains is not quick or cheap. Factories would have to be retooled. Contracts with suppliers would have to be renegotiated. Entire logistics systems would have to be rebuilt. For an industry that operates on tight margins and precise timing, even small disruptions can create enormous problems. But the auto sector is only one piece of the puzzle. Energy is another. In fact, some analysts believe the energy relationship between the United States and its neighbors is even more important than trade in manufactured goods. Canada is the largest supplier of crude oil to the United States. Every day, millions of barrels flow south across the border through pipelines and rail networks. Mexico also supplies petroleum products that are essential for the American Southwest. Together, Canada and Mexico account for a massive share of America's imported energy supply. That means any confrontation affecting those flows could have serious consequences for fuel prices. When Canadian officials hinted that energy exports could become part of potential retaliatory measures, markets reacted quickly. Energy futures jumped across multiple exchanges as traders began calculating the potential impact of even minor disruptions. The message was clear. If energy flows between the three countries are affected, gasoline prices could rise rapidly. And that is the kind of economic pressure that governments feel immediately. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, something else may already be happening. Diplomatic sources suggest that Canada and Mexico have been speaking with other major economies, including European and Asian partners, about strengthening trade relationships outside North America. If those discussions accelerate, the United States could face a situation where its two largest trading partners begin diversifying their economic alliances more aggressively. That possibility represents a profound strategic shift. For decades, North America has functioned as a tightly connected economic bloc. If that structure begins to weaken, the global trade landscape could change dramatically, and investors appear to be watching closely. On the day tensions escalated, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped hundreds of points, reflecting rising uncertainty in American markets. Meanwhile, Canadian markets held relatively steady, and Mexico's main stock index even posted gains. Money tends to move towards stability. Right now, many investors appear unsure where stability will come from. To understand why this standoff has become so intense, it helps to look at the strategies being used by the leaders involved. Donald Trump has always favored aggressive negotiating tactics. His approach often involves creating pressure quickly, forcing opponents to react under tight deadlines and pushing for concessions before they have time to organize a response. In many situations, that strategy works. Speed can create confusion. Pressure can force compromises. But this time the dynamic changed because both Canada and Mexico refused to respond separately. Instead of negotiating individually, they aligned their positions and presented a united front. That shift matters enormously. When negotiations involve one powerful country facing two smaller partners individually, the larger economy has clear leverage. But when those partners coordinate their responses, the balance changes. Together, Canada and Mexico represent a massive economic force. Combined, their economies are among the largest in the world. Their industries are deeply tied to American supply chains, and their cooperation makes it far harder to isolate either country. For Trump, that creates a strategic dilemma. If he proceeds with the threatened tariffs, American consumers and businesses will feel the impact quickly. Car prices could rise, agricultural trade could slow, manufacturing disruptions could affect jobs in key states. But if he backs down after issuing public demands, critics will portray it as a political defeat. That tension is reportedly creating intense debates within Washington. Economic advisors have reportedly presented projections showing that prolonged trade disruptions could result in significant job losses in manufacturing sectors within months. Members of Congress from states with heavy cross-border trade are also watching closely. Industries that depend on trade with Canada and Mexico include agriculture, automotive manufacturing, energy production, technology, and logistics. Any disruption would ripple through these sectors. Meanwhile, Canada and Mexico appear determined to maintain their coordinated stance. Prime Minister Mark Carney brings a unique background to the situation. Before entering politics, he served as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. During the 2008 financial crisis and the turbulent years surrounding Brexit, he earned a reputation for steady leadership and deep understanding of global financial systems. That experience means he approaches economic conflicts with a highly analytical mindset. President Claudia Sheinbaum also brings a distinctive perspective. Trained as a scientist and engineer, She has built her political career around policy planning and long-term development strategies. Under her leadership, Mexico has been expanding its manufacturing sector and strengthening economic relationships with multiple international partners. Together, the two leaders appear to be presenting themselves as defenders of predictable global trade rules. That contrast is becoming increasingly important internationally. Many governments around the world have grown frustrated with unpredictable economic policies and sudden shifts in trade relationships. If Canada and Mexico successfully frame their stance as a defense of stable trade rules, they may gain support from other global partners, and that could reshape the diplomatic landscape surrounding the dispute. So, where does all of this lead next? Right now, analysts see three possible paths. The first scenario is what some economists call the deep freeze. In this outcome, tariffs are imposed, both sides retaliate, and trade slows significantly. Prices rise, supply chains struggle, and businesses face months of uncertainty. Eventually, political pressure from industries, consumers, and lawmakers forces all three governments back to the negotiating table. After a painful period of disruption, a revised agreement emerges. The second scenario is far more severe. In this outcome, the United States withdraws entirely from the USMCA framework and imposes sweeping restrictions on cross-border trade. Canada and Mexico respond by redirecting their economic partnerships toward Europe and Asia. If that happens, the integrated North American economy that developed over the past 3 decades could fracture permanently. Energy prices could spike, manufacturing industries could face major restructuring, and the economic consequences could spread far beyond the continent. The third scenario is perhaps the most transformative. In this case, Canada and Mexico accelerate efforts to diversify their trade relationships while maintaining limited cooperation with the United States. Over time, new global trade networks emerge, reducing America's central role in North American commerce. If that happens, the balance of economic influence across the continent could shift dramatically. At the moment, many analysts believe the first scenario remains the most likely, but the situation is evolving rapidly, and political decisions made in the coming days could determine which path becomes reality. What is clear is that something fundamental has already changed. For decades, the United States held overwhelming influence within North America's trade system. When Washington pushed for changes, its neighbors often negotiated cautiously and ultimately compromised. This time was different. Canada and Mexico responded together. They rejected the demands simultaneously, and they signaled that they are prepared to defend their economic interests, even if it means confronting their largest trading partner. That shift alone marks a significant moment in the history of North American relations. Because once countries demonstrate they are willing to stand firm together, the entire negotiating dynamic changes. The coming weeks will reveal whether this confrontation leads to compromise, escalation, or a complete rethinking of how the continent's economies interact. But one thing is certain. The system that allowed $1.6 trillion in goods to move across North America each year without major disruption is now facing its most serious test in decades. And the outcome will affect far more than political headlines. It could shape the future of industries, jobs, and global trade relationships for years to come. So the real question now is simple. Is this a temporary clash that will eventually settle into a new agreement? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a major economic realignment across North America? Whatever the answer turns out to be, the next chapter is already beginning to unfold. If you want clear, powerful breakdowns of global politics, war strategy, and the hidden forces shaping world events, make sure you subscribe to BCC News, turn on notifications, and stay ahead of the story before everyone else catches up.